The leaders of Israel have come out and openly admitted that their goal is to take over all of Gaza, to destroy the Gaza Strip, and to try to expel the Palestinian population. And they have the full support of the United States and previously U.S. President Joe Biden and now U.S. President Donald Trump. The U.S. has given Israel tens of billions of dollars in military aid. The U.S. has repeatedly vetoed resolutions in the UN Security Council that would take action against Israel. And Washington is ensuring that Israeli officials have total impunity. Trump put sanctions on the International Criminal Court to prevent The Hague from investigating war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And Israeli officials know that there will be no consequences for the crimes they commit, which is why Netanyahu has now come out openly and admitted that he's going to, quote, take control of all, end quote, of the Gaza Strip. This was reported by the major French newspaper Le Monde. In a video that Netanyahu published on the 19th of May, he said, quote, "We will take control of all the territory of the Strip," end quote. And he also said, quote, "We must act in a way that cannot be stopped," end quote. Now, Israel restarted its brutal war on Gaza after Donald Trump personally gave Netanyahu a green light. This was reported by the Wall Street Journal and major newspapers in Israel. Before Trump had returned to the White House for his second term as U.S. president in January, he briefly brokered a so-called ceasefire, but in reality, Israel was using the time of the so-called ceasefire to get more weapons and ammunition from the U.S., to restore its military forces, and to prepare for an all-out war to take over all of Gaza, which is what it's doing now, with not only a green light, but total support from the U.S. government. The Trump administration has been trying to find a way to expel the Palestinian population in Gaza. And one of the proposals that Trump made is to force Palestinians across the border into the Sinai Peninsula, into Egypt. But the Egyptian government said no. So then Trump also told Jordan that he wants to force Palestinians to move out of Gaza into Jordan through ethnic cleansing. And the Jordanian government also said no. So now Trump is pressuring other countries, including in Africa. He's trying to force the government of Libya to take at least 1 million Palestinians. And as leverage, the Trump administration is telling Libya that it will give it the billions of dollars of assets that the U.S. froze illegally back in 2011 when the U.S. and NATO waged a war to overthrow Libya's longtime anti-colonial leader, Muammar Gaddafi. They killed Gaddafi, they overthrew the Libyan government, and the U.S. government seized over $30 billion of Libyan assets. And for over a decade, the U.S. and the European Union have been sitting on these frozen assets. So blackmailing countries like Libya is part of the Trump administration's strategy to help Israel to ethnically cleanse Palestinians in order to take over all of Gaza, which Netanyahu is now admitting is the goal. And I should point out that I and other critics have been saying this from the very beginning of Israel's brutal war on Gaza, that Israel's goal was always to expel the Palestinians, to take over their land, to colonize their land. This has been a process that's been going on for decades. And historians like the scholar Rashid Khalidi have shown how the U.S. government has always helped Israel to colonize Palestinian land while falsely claiming to be supporting a so-called peace process in which the Palestinians have their land taken more and more, colonized more and more every single year, while they have no sovereignty, no state. They have their rights blatantly violated by the U.S. and Israel, which are constantly violating international law on a daily basis. And today, the situation in Gaza is very, very desperate. As of the 20th of May, Israel has been maintaining a blockade of Gaza for more than 11 weeks, and the top UN humanitarian chief warned that due to Israel's blockade of Gaza, 14,000 Palestinian babies could die within 48 hours, could starve to death because Israel is refusing to allow significant aid to go in. Now, the Israeli regime is claiming that they're allowing some aid in, but the UN humanitarian chief reported that only 5 aid trucks were allowed to go into Gaza. Gaza has a population of more than 2 million Palestinians. At least it did before Israel killed huge numbers. We don't know how many Palestinians have been killed by Israel. And now many more could starve to death because Israel only allowed 5 aid trucks to go in to try to feed 2 million people, which is obviously impossible. And this is part of the Israeli regime's extremely cynical strategy. Netanyahu himself told far-right critics, because far-right extremists in Israel want to starve all of the Palestinians in Gaza to death. They want to kill all Palestinians. So Netanyahu, who himself is very far-right, and he's surrounded by far-right allies, he's telling people even more to the extreme right of him, don't worry. He's saying that the only reason we're allowing 5 aid trucks to go in is to, quote, avoid famine for practical and diplomatic reasons, end quote. This was reported by the leading Israeli newspaper Haaretz. And Netanyahu's far-right ally, the finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, one of the most extreme far-right people in the world, in a government in the world, he boasted that Israel is, quote, destroying everything left in the Gaza Strip, end quote. That is an exact quote from a top Israeli official, one of the most powerful ministers in the government, boasting that they are, quote, destroying everything left in the Gaza Strip, end quote. Now, the website Dropsite News published an article explaining this very cynical strategy being used by Israel, which includes longer quotes from these top Israeli officials, and they're truly blood-curdling. Now, I already cited the quote in which Netanyahu pledged to take over all of Gaza, but Netanyahu also explained, quote, our best friends in the world, senators I know as strong supporters of Israel, he's talking about US senators, quote, have warned that they cannot support us if images of mass starvation emerge. They come to me and say, we'll give you all the help you need to win the war, but we can't be receiving pictures of famine, end quote. So then Netanyahu said, okay, we're going to allow a few aid trucks in, not enough to actually feed Palestinians, but just enough so Israel can continue to take over all of Gaza. He said, quote, we need to do it in a way that they won't stop us, end quote. So Netanyahu is saying, look, the US government is 100% supporting us as we carry out this ethnic cleansing to expel Palestinians, but we can't cause famine publicly because the media will criticize us. So we have to make sure that maybe not everyone starves to death. Maybe only tens of thousands of Palestinians will die. And Netanyahu's far-right ally, the minister Smotrich, said even more clearly what their goal is. He said the aid scheme will, quote, allow our friends in the world to continue to provide us with an international umbrella of protection against the Security Council and the Hague Tribunal, and for us to continue to fight, God willing, until victory, end quote. So here, it's a very clear admission by a top Israeli regime official that the US government is protecting Israel and preventing the UN Security Council from taking action because Washington has veto power in the Security Council and has used it repeatedly, including under Biden and now continuing under Trump. This is bipartisan, to protect Israel, to allow it to carry out these crimes against humanity against the Palestinian people. And this Israeli regime official acknowledged that the US is protecting Israel from the International Criminal Court at The Hague. And again, the Trump White House boasted that it put sanctions on the ICC to protect Israel. But that's not all. This Israeli minister Smotrich continued, and he explained, telling his, far-right critics, people who are even more far-right than he is, as if, I don't even know if that's possible. They're so far-right already. But he boasted, quote, the aid that will enter Gaza in the coming days is the tiniest amount, a handful of bakeries that will hand out pita bread to people in public kitchens. People in Gaza will get a pita and a food plate, and that's it. Exactly what we were seeing in the videos. People standing in line and waiting to have someone serve them with some soup plate, end quote. That is a quote from a top Israeli minister admitting that they are using hunger as a weapon against 2 million Palestinian civilians and trying to starve them, giving them just barely enough, a little bread, so not everyone dies, so there's not famine, but a lot of Palestinians will die, and a lot of Palestinians have already died in this intentional crime against humanity being carried out by Israel with the full support of the US government. By the way, if you want to get an idea of who this guy Smotrich is, back in 2023, in January, before the war started in October, this Israeli minister Smotrich, he said in a TV interview, he described himself as a, quote, fascist homophobe, end quote. He described himself as a fascist homophobe. Now, his supporters would say that that was a sarcastic comment. But, I mean, again, this is a far-right extremist, and he said he's a fascist homophobe, but then he said, semi-jokingly, quote, I won't stone gays as long as they don't feed me shrimp, end quote. So this is the kind of person we're talking about. I mean, this is one of the most far-right extremist politicians in the entire world. He is one of the most powerful people in the Israeli regime. Back in November 2023, just a few weeks after the war in Gaza started, Smotrich called for the so-called voluntary migration of Palestinians. And this is why I and many other critics have been pointing out that the goal was always ethnic cleansing. The Israeli regime always wanted to force out the Palestinian population. And of course, they claim it's so-called voluntary, but it's not voluntary when you're being bombed with US bombs and the Israeli regime, with the support of the US, is killing your family members and your friends and your neighbors and forcing you out. That's not voluntary migration. That's ethnic cleansing. Then in April of 2024, Smotrich called for the, quote, total annihilation, end quote, of Gaza. And by the way, all of these quotes that I'm citing are from the Israeli media, not foreign media. This is from Israel's newspapers. Smotrich, who is a member of the security cabinet of the Israeli regime, he said, quote, there are no half measures. The Gazan cities of Rafah, Derabala, Nusayrat, total annihilation. You will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, end quote. And there he was quoting the Bible when God ordered the annihilation of the nation of Amalek. And repeatedly, Israeli regime officials, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, have invoked this biblical verse to call for annihilating the Palestinian nation. And Smotrich is very clear. He's proud of the fact that he wants to eliminate the Palestinian people. He said it very clearly back in August of 2024. He argued it would be justified for Israel to starve all 2 million Gazans to death. This is an exact quote from a top Israeli regime official. Quote, we bring in aid because there is no choice. Nobody will let us cause 2 million civilian deaths to die of hunger, even though it might be justified and moral, end quote. So this Israeli regime official was saying that he wants to starve all Palestinians to death. He considers it justified and moral, but the international community will not allow Israel to do that. And by the way, it's not just Gaza that the Israeli regime wants to control. Smotrich made it very clear that after taking over all of Gaza, the Israeli regime is going to annex the West Bank. And in Israel, in Hebrew, they use the term Judea and Samaria to refer to the West Bank, which, according to international law, is Palestinian territory that has been illegally occupied by Israel since 1967. This has been reaffirmed dozens of times at the United Nations and in international legal institutions, including the International Court of Justice. But a few days after the US presidential election in November 2024, when Trump won the election, Smotrich was celebrating, and he tweeted that 2025 will be the year that Israel takes over so-called Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, which was hinting that the Trump administration is going to allow Israel to annex the West Bank. So after they take over Gaza, their next goal will be to take over the West Bank and to have total control of all of historic Palestine. And what they do to the Palestinian population, of course, we don't know, but They want to ethnically cleanse all of the Palestinians who survive, who aren't killed by Israel. And I need to emphasize that everything that Israel is doing has the full support of the US government, from both Republicans and Democrats, from the previous Biden-Harris administration and now from the Trump administration. And Trump has taken many actions to facilitate these crimes against humanity, including just 2 weeks after Trump returned to the White House, he boasted of putting sanctions on the International Criminal Court, the ICC, because it charged Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and the former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Legal experts and human rights organizations said very clearly that Trump's sanctions on the ICC were a direct attack on the rule of law to protect Israel, to help it carry out these crimes against humanity. Of course, I should point out that this is bipartisan. The Biden administration also threatened sanctions on the ICC. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State under Biden, was asked, and he said that the Biden administration would work with Congress to put sanctions against the ICC after it opened its investigation into Netanyahu. But it was the Trump administration that actually put those sanctions on the ICC. Now, the Associated Press published a shocking report in May that details how the Trump administration has completely paralyzed the ICC and made it impossible for The Hague to investigate the war crimes committed by Israeli officials. And this report noted that the chief prosecutor of the ICC, who is a British lawyer, Karim Khan, he had his email account frozen and his bank accounts frozen. He's British. He's not even American. But because of the US sanctions, he can't use his email and he can't use his bank accounts. And American staffers, US citizens who work at the ICC, have been warned that if they return to the US, the Trump administration will arrest them. So again, the US government is threatening to arrest its own citizens for working at the International Criminal Court to investigate the crimes against humanity carried out by the Israeli regime backed by the US. I mean, this is a full frontal assault on the rule of law, on all international institutions in defense of colonialism and crimes against humanity. And this report noted that now other non-governmental organizations and legal groups have stopped working with The Hague because they're afraid of secondary sanctions by the US government. And US corporations are complicit in what is going on here. For instance, the Associated Press reported that Microsoft canceled the email address used by the prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan. And the Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported that Microsoft is providing AI, artificial intelligence technology, to Israel. Of course, Microsoft claims that supposedly Israel is not using AI to harm Palestinians. That's so ridiculous. But it's not just Microsoft, it's also British banks. Again, the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan is British, not a US citizen, and yet the US sanctions on him are destroying his life. And in the UK, his bank accounts were frozen, and staffers at non-governmental organizations that help the ICC carry out its legal investigations have stopped all work with The Hague because of Trump sanctions. And this is why it's completely ridiculous seeing these reports in the Western media claim that supposedly Donald Trump is frustrated with the Gaza war and he wants Israel to wrap it up. In order to believe this, you have to ignore everything else that Trump has been doing to facilitate Israel's crimes against humanity. And by the way, I should point out that Trump administration officials have denied this report, claiming it's fake news. Trump's hostage envoy did an interview with Fox News, and he said that it's not true that Trump is pressuring Israel to stop the war and criticizing Israel. He made it clear that the Trump administration is 100% on board with all of these crimes, which is not at all a surprise because back in 2024, when Trump was campaigning for president, Trump boasted that he is the most pro-Israel president in U.S. history, and that back in his first term as U.S. president, he did everything Israel wanted.
I gave them Golan Heights. I gave them the Abraham Accords. I recognized the capital of Israel and opened the embassy in Jerusalem. Gave them billions and billions of dollars. I was the best friend Israel ever had.
And we're supposed to believe that in private, Trump is quietly telling Israel to end the war. But this is completely contradicted by what Trump has repeatedly said in public. He has constantly boasted that the U.S. is going to take over Gaza. And in a meeting in Qatar in May, Trump said that the U.S. is going to take over Gaza and turn it into a so-called freedom zone. And Trump has repeatedly said this, including in a meeting at the White House when Trump was standing next to Netanyahu and he promised that the U.S. would take over Gaza.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it. You know, Gaza is interesting. It's a phenomenal location. On the sea, some fantastic things could be done with Gaza.
Moreover, even if it is true that supposedly Trump is pressuring Israel in private to stop the war in Gaza, I'm skeptical. But assume that's true. It doesn't matter. It's just PR, because in reality, Trump continues to give Israel the billions of dollars of weapons and military assistance that it needs to carry out this war. In March, the Trump administration approved nearly $3 billion of weapons for Israel. Immediately after Trump returned to the White House in January, he lifted all restrictions on arms exports to Israel, and he reversed a policy that Biden had also done for cynical public relations reasons. Biden also gave Israel billions of dollars of weapons, but he paused the export of bunker buster bombs, these massive 2,000-pound bombs, to try to claim that supposedly he was protecting human rights in Gaza, which is absurd. Biden was just as complicit as Trump. But then Trump came in, and a few days after entering the White House, Trump lifted all restrictions. And then in February, a few weeks later, Reuters reported that Israel received heavy bunker buster bombs from the U.S. And what did Israel do with these bunker buster bombs? Well, the BBC, British state media, admitted that Israel used the bunker buster bombs provided by Trump to bomb hospitals in Gaza. This is a crime. This is a blatant war crime that Donald Trump is personally responsible for. He's the individual who ordered the export of bunker buster bombs to Israel, which were used to bomb hospitals in Gaza. It's as clear as day. This is why Benjamin Netanyahu praised Trump as the, quote, greatest friend ever, end quote, of Israel back in March, and he thanked Trump for giving billions of dollars of weapons and ammunition to Israel to help carry out these crimes against humanity.
You are the greatest friend Israel has ever had in the White House.
So this is why I think we should be extremely skeptical of these reports in the Western media claiming that Trump is mad at Israel and he's telling Israel to stop, because we saw similar reports when Biden was president. There were many reports, including in the Israeli media, that Biden was yelling at Netanyahu and calling him a liar. But none of that matters. It's all a distraction. It's all PR to save face, because at the same time, the Biden administration gave Israel over $18 billion of military aid. And we saw the same thing happen back when Barack Obama was president. There were many reports in the Western media talking about how Obama and Netanyahu hated each other. The Washington Post published an article explaining the roots of why Obama and Netanyahu dislike each other so much. But none of that actually mattered. It was all a distraction, because what happened? Obama gave Israel the largest military aid package in U.S. history at the time, which was $38 billion in military aid over the next decade. That was during Obama's second term as president. So he didn't do it to win re-election. He wasn't concerned about re-election. What this shows is it doesn't matter if individually Biden and Obama didn't like Netanyahu, or even if Trump supposedly yells at Netanyahu. Again, I'm skeptical, because at the end of the day, they continue to give the Israeli regime the weapons and military assistance that it needs to carry out this war. Israeli media outlets have repeatedly reported that without U.S. support, Israel could not wage this war, period. The only reason that Israel can carry out these crimes against humanity is because the U.S. empire is protecting it and giving it the weapons and ammunition it needs to do so. Because Israel is absolutely crucial for the U.S. empire. This was admitted by the previous U.S. Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, who famously said, quote, "Israel is the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk. It is located in a critical region for American national security," end quote. Netanyahu himself boasted back in 2017 that Israel is, quote, "a mighty aircraft carrier," end quote, of the United States, of the U.S. empire. And by the way, Netanyahu, who's basically the king of Israel, the longest serving prime minister of Israel, he is an American. Netanyahu was raised and educated in the United States. He went to high school in Pennsylvania. He went to college at MIT. He got his first job in Boston. Netanyahu was a U.S. citizen, not just once, but twice. He was a U.S. citizen. He then gave up his citizenship. He got U.S. citizenship again, and then he gave it up again to be Prime Minister of Israel. Netanyahu is an American. Specifically, he's a Republican. He's been close friends with many Republicans like Donald Trump and Mitt Romney for years. Israel is a colonial outpost of the U.S. empire in one of the most geostrategic regions on earth. If you don't believe me, it was former U.S. President Joe Biden who repeatedly said over decades that if Israel did not exist, the U.S. would have to create Israel in order to serve U.S. imperial interests in West Asia, in the Middle East.
Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
I've often said, Mr. President, if there were not an Israel, we'd have to invent one. I've long said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it.
If you want to learn more about the geopolitical reasons why the U.S. empire so strongly supports Israel, in the description below, I will link to another video that I did with the economist Michael Hudson explaining why the U.S. empire loves Israel and why it's bipartisan. But on that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.